Before we begin this journey into one of the most powerful and tragic stories of the medieval world, take a moment, hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the channel. Because today, we travel back to the 14th century, to a golden kingdom standing on the edge of darkness, a world ruled by faith, war, and glory, soon to be undone by a shadow no sword could strike. This is the story of Edward III, King of England, and of the storm that crossed the sea. In the year 1340, England was rich, proud, and unstoppable. Under King Edward III, the realm had risen from the troubled days of his father into an age of triumph. Edward was the perfect medieval king, young, tall, commanding, a warrior and a dreamer. His people adored him. His knights worshipped him. The court at Westminster glittered with wealth and chivalry, and across the kingdom, people believed England was chosen by God himself. The streets of London buzzed with life. Foreign merchants called out in a dozen languages. The clatter of hooves echoed on cobblestones, and the smell of wool, iron, and salt filled the air. England's markets were the richest in Europe. Ships lined the Thames, carrying goods from Flanders, Spain, and the Hanseatic ports. Gold flowed like water. For generations, the English people had measured their lives by divine order. God above, king below, lords in between, peasants at the bottom. Each man knew his place, each woman her duty. The rhythm of prayer and labor governed everything. The church stood tall over every town, its bells ringing out the hours of life and death. And to those who lived in this world, it seemed eternal, an order blessed by heaven. But across the sea, war had begun. In 1337, the French King Philip VI had seized English lands in France and denied Edward's claim to the French throne. Edward, whose mother was a princess of France, believed the crown of France was his by right. Pride, politics, and destiny collided, and England was drawn into what would become the 100 Years' War. To the people, it was more than politics, it was the will of God, a divine struggle between two nations for the soul of Europe. Edward called his banners, and England answered. The countryside erupted with the sound of mustering armies, blacksmiths hammering armor, archers cutting yew for longbows, farmers leaving their fields to fight for their king. In 1340, England launched one of the first great naval battles in history, the Battle of Sluys. Hundreds of ships clashed in the grey waters of the Channel. Edward himself led the fleet, his banner flying from the mast. When the sun set that night, the sea was red. The English had destroyed almost the entire French navy. The victory was absolute. England ruled the waves, and Edward returned home a hero. But glory had its price. War cost gold, and gold meant taxes. Merchants grumbled. Farmers struggled. Yet no one doubted the king. His charisma was iron, his courage contagious. His people believed in him completely. Under Edward's rule, the kingdom expanded in power, wealth, and pride. London became a world capital, where merchants from Italy, the Baltic, and Iberia came to trade. The city was crowded, loud and alive, a labyrinth of stone bridges, timber houses, and church spires rising through the fog. Across the Channel, however, the continent was changing in ways no one understood. The 14th century was both the height and the breaking point of medieval Europe. The cathedrals of France and Germany soared higher than ever, but the soil beneath them was failing. The climate had begun to shift. The Little Ice Age had arrived. Summers grew shorter, winters colder, and harvests failed. In the countryside, hunger lingered at the edge of every season. Still, life went on. Europe's trade network stretched further than ever before. Italian ships sailed to the Levant and beyond, to the ports of the Black Sea. Through these routes came silk, spices, and whispers. Traders began to speak of strange sicknesses in the east, rumors of whole villages disappearing, of caravans found dead along the Silk Road. In the markets of Constantinople and the docks of Genoa, sailors told tales of a black fever that killed without mercy. But such stories were dismissed as superstition. In England, where the seas served as both moat and blessing, no one cared for tales from the east. The Channel had kept England safe for centuries. Even the Pope had once called it God's Wall. The idea that a sickness could cross it was unthinkable. The people believed themselves protected by their king, their island, and their faith. Edward's mind was consumed by war. In 1346 he launched his most ambitious campaign yet, the invasion of France. He gathered an army of 30,000 knights, archers, squires, men-at-arms, and sailed across the Channel to Normandy. His son, the young Prince Edward, soon to be known as the Black Prince, rode beside him. Chroniclers wrote that when the English landed, they moved like a storm. They burned villages, seized supplies, and defeated every force sent against them. On the 26th of August, 1346, near a small village called Crecy, the English met the French in one of the most famous battles of the age. The French army outnumbered them 2-1. Their knights, glittering in polished armor, charged again and again up the hill where the English stood. But the English archers, disciplined, deadly, armed with longbows, rained down arrows by the tens of thousands. Horses fell screaming. Men choked on their own blood. The French charges broke like waves on rock. When it was over, thousands of France's finest lay dead. Edward's army had achieved an impossible victory. It was more than a battle. It was proof that England was chosen, that God himself fought beside their king. The chroniclers in Westminster wrote that no nation had seen such power since the days of King Arthur. Priests preached that England's triumphs were divine reward. The people sang of Edward as the Lion of the North. The war dragged on, but England seemed unstoppable. Edward's banners flew over Calais. His navy ruled the sea, and his subjects looked to the future with pride. The king was adored. His sons were growing into warriors. The treasury overflowed with spoils from France. It was an age of gold and confidence. Yet, even as England celebrated, the world began to change in ways invisible and vast. Far to the southeast, in the trading cities of the Black Sea, death had found a way to travel. In 1346, the Mongol armies of the Golden Horde besieged the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in Crimea. As the siege dragged on, the Mongols began to die not by sword, but by a strange, unstoppable illness. Their bodies broke out in black swellings. Their skin turned ashen. When their numbers thinned, they resorted to something no one had seen before. They hurled the corpses of the dead over the city walls with catapults. The defenders, choking on the stench, fled to their ships. Those ships sailed west toward Sicily, toward Genoa, toward Venice. In their holds, unseen among the grain and cloth, were rats. And on those rats rode fleas. And within those fleas, something microscopic and merciless, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though no one then could name it. By the time the survivors reached Italy, they were already dying. When their ships docked in Messina, the townspeople came to unload the cargo and found only corpses. The city tried to drive the ships away, but it was too late. The disease had already spread. Within weeks, the ports of Genoa and Marseille were infected. From there, the plague raced northward, faster than anyone could comprehend. In London, no one yet knew. The court was consumed with victory, the army preparing for another campaign. The lords feasted. The merchants counted their profits. Across the realm, the people prayed with confidence that England's fortune would never falter. But the signs were there, if anyone had cared to see. The weather turned strange again. That winter was bitterly cold, the following spring too wet to sow. Crops rotted and cattle died in their stalls. The monks of Canterbury recorded a foulness in the air, a heaviness of spirit. Birds fell dead from the sky. The air itself seemed uneasy. In Italy, whole families vanished overnight. In the south of France, bodies filled the streets. Priests gave last rites until they too collapsed. The disease showed no mercy. It struck rich and poor alike, and always it came from the ships. By late 1346, merchants arriving in England brought rumors of a great mortality spreading through Europe. Edward's advisors dismissed them. The channel was wide, they said. England was safe. The Almighty would protect his faithful. And so, the king turned his gaze once more toward France. He founded the Order of the Garter, a fellowship of knights sworn to honor, courage, and loyalty. Tournaments filled the courtyards of Windsor with color and song. The realm celebrated its power, its faith, its destiny. None of them could imagine how close the darkness already was. In the harbors of Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, rats scurried ashore. In their fur, the plague multiplied. In the bellies of ships, it traveled north. The disease had already reached the gates of Paris and the ports of Normandy, and across the cold gray waters of the Channel, the wind began to shift. Edward III ruled a kingdom of gold and glory, but beyond that horizon, A silent fleet was already on the move, ships with no living crew, sails torn, their cargo rotting in the hold. They came not for conquest, not for trade, but for the living themselves. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was at sea. And soon, it would make landfall. They came without warning. They came on the wind and the waves, in the dark belly of ships that creaked through the harbors of the Mediterranean. They came not with armies or banners, but with silence and the smell of rot. In the autumn of 1347, the first of the ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. They had sailed from the Crimea, from the besieged port of Kaffa, where men had died by the thousands and their corpses had been thrown like weapons over the city walls. Now these ships drifted into Messina's harbor, their sails slack, their decks eerily still. The dock workers who went aboard found only horror. The sailors lay where they had fallen, faces blackened, their skin covered with swellings the size of eggs. Some had bled from their mouths and ears. The few still alive whispered deliriously, begging for water, for forgiveness, for death. When the townspeople realized what they were seeing, they fled, screaming, into the streets. The city tried to drive the ships away, ordering them back to sea, but it was too late. The rats had already come ashore, and with them, the fleas that carried death. Within days, Messina was dying. Priests filled the air with incense, hoping to cleanse it. The bells of the churches tolled without rest. The doctors, cloaked in long robes and masks stuffed with herbs, could do nothing but watch. By the time the authorities in Sicily sealed the harbor, the plague had already spread to Genoa and Venice, the beating hearts of Mediterranean trade. From there, the disease traveled faster than any army could march. It rode with merchants, sailors, and pilgrims. Ships that left one port healthy arrived at the next filled with corpses. In the great city of Marseille, bodies were piled in the streets. In Avignon, where the Pope resided, the air stank of burning pitch as fires were lit day and night to purify the air. The sickness defied every understanding of medicine. It began with fever and pain, then swelling black buboes in the armpits and groin. Victims coughed blood and died within 3 days. Some collapsed in the streets. Others died alone in locked rooms, their doors marked with chalk crosses. The chroniclers of Italy and France wrote that even the birds seemed to vanish from the skies. The cities grew quiet, save for the wails of the dying. In one letter from Florence, a merchant wrote, "We have buried every man we know. I cannot write more, for death stands at my door." By winter, the plague had spread through France, Spain, and the German states. The roads that had once carried trade now carried death. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites unknowingly brought the sickness with them. No region was spared. England watched from across the Channel. At first, the news came as rumor, strange tales told by sailors and travelers. In the markets of London, people whispered that in Italy, entire cities had fallen silent. In Paris, there was no one left to bury the dead. The word pestilence appeared in letters, then in sermons. But most dismissed it. England was safe, they said. The sea would protect them. God would protect them. Even Edward III, busy with his campaigns in France, did not believe the threat was real. His victories at Crecy and Calais had filled his treasury and his pride. When reports reached him that the ports of Normandy were closing due to a great mortality, he brushed them aside. France's troubles were France's punishment. But as the year 1348 began, ships continued to cross the Channel. Trade could not stop. England's economy depended on it. Merchants sailed from Gascony, Brittany, and Calais, bringing wine, salt, and grain. On board, unseen and unstoppable, were rats and fleas. The shadow had found its way across the sea. In the summer of 1348, the Kingdom of England drew its breath and stepped into the abyss. For months, rumors had crossed the channel of cities in France, where the streets were piled with corpses, of priests who could no longer bury the dead, of a sickness that turned flesh black as pitch. People in England whispered of it in taverns and marketplaces, but few truly believed. England was an island. The sea had always been its shield. The people trusted that the winds of God would keep them safe. Even as letters arrived from Normandy and Gascony describing a great mortality, the ports remained open. Trade was life, and no one would risk it for ghost stories. But on a warm day in June, a single ship changed everything. It came from Gascony, docking at the small port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. The crew staggered down the gangplank, pale and trembling, covered in strange swellings beneath their arms and around their groins. They coughed blood into the water as they walked. Within days, the porters who had unloaded the cargo fell sick. The sailors died first, their bodies blackened by disease. Then the townspeople began to collapse. The priests who came to comfort them soon followed. By the time the local sheriff sent word to London, Melcombe Regis was already a graveyard. The disease spread inland with terrifying speed. It moved along the roads, carried by travelers and merchants. The first symptoms were small: fever, exhaustion, a chill that would not fade. Then came the swelling, great lumps in the armpits, neck, or groin, darkening until they split. Blood turned thick, breath came short, and within 3 days, the victim was dead. No one understood what it was. The doctors of the time, men who still believed that disease came from the imbalance of the body's humors, tried everything. They bled their patients, applied leeches, burned herbs, and filled rooms with smoke. None survived. In Bristol, the sickness arrived by midsummer. The harbor that had once echoed with the sound of hammers and sailors now reeked of decay. Entire crews died at anchor. Shops closed, markets emptied. None were left to bury the dead, wrote one chronicler, and the living fled in terror. From Bristol, the plague spread like fire to Salisbury, Exeter, Winchester, and finally, London. The capital was a labyrinth of filth, narrow lanes, overflowing cesspits, and stagnant ditches. When the plague came, it moved through the city like a living thing. The poor died first, packed into the slums near the river. But soon the rich fell too. The disease cared for no rank or title. By September, the city was dying. Bells tolled endlessly from the steeples. Funeral processions gave way to carts piled high with corpses. The ground at St. Paul's was full within weeks. The churchyards overflowed, and the city dug great pits outside its walls. At Charterhouse, monks opened a new burial ground, later known as the Plague Pit, where thousands were laid side by side, without coffins, without names. The stench was unbearable. People carried flowers, herbs, or vinegar-soaked cloths against their faces. The air itself seemed poisonous. Chroniclers wrote that London reeked of death from one end to the other. The physicians were powerless. Many fled the city. Those who stayed wore strange masks shaped like birds, their long beaks stuffed with herbs to filter the corrupted air. They advised burning incense, bathing in vinegar, and avoiding meat. Some claimed that laughter could drive off the disease. Others blamed the stars, the Jews, the foreigners, or sin itself. The church urged repentance. Priests held processions through the streets, chanting for God's mercy. In Westminster Abbey, monks prayed day and night, but their ranks thinned with every sunrise. By winter, most of London's clergy were dead. The people's faith began to falter. If even God's servants could perish, who could be saved? Families locked themselves in their homes, refusing to let anyone in or out. Neighbors stopped speaking. Strangers were beaten away from doors. In some districts, entire households vanished overnight. The only sound in the streets was the creak of death carts and the cry of, "Bring out your dead." In the countryside, it was no better. The plague followed the roads and rivers, moving faster than word could spread. Villages in Kent, Sussex, and Surrey emptied. Whole parishes lost their priests and were left without mass or burial rites. The harvest rotted in the fields. Sheep and cattle wandered untended. In Oxford and Cambridge, the universities closed. Scholars fled. The libraries fell silent. At Winchester, the great cathedral that had once echoed with music became a house of mourning. Everywhere, the same pattern repeated: fever, death, silence. By autumn, the sickness had reached the royal court. Edward III, who had withdrawn to Windsor with his family, could no longer deny the truth. His counselors urged him to seal the ports, to stop trade, but the order came too late. The kingdom was already infected. Even the royal physicians fell ill. The king watched helplessly as two of his sons, William of Hatfield and Thomas of Windsor, succumbed to the disease. Their bodies were buried in haste, without ceremony, for fear of contagion. The court, once filled with music and laughter, became a place of whispers and fear. Servants fled. Ministers died. The corridors of Windsor grew quiet. Edward, who had commanded armies and ruled empires, was powerless. He ordered nationwide fasting and prayer. decreeing that every church ring its bells at noon to beg God for mercy. But even in his faith, there was doubt. He had always believed that England was favored by heaven, yet now it seemed abandoned. Outside the castle walls, the kingdom unraveled. With so many dead, the machinery of government broke down. Sheriffs could not collect taxes, judges could not hold court. In many towns there was no one left to enforce the law. Thieves and beggars roamed freely. Bands of desperate men robbed travelers and burned empty houses for warmth. The church, the crown, and the people all were helpless before the same invisible enemy. By December 1348, London was unrecognizable. The plague had killed nearly half the city's inhabitants. The Thames ran quiet. The markets were empty. The bells that had once rung for victory now rang only for the dead. The chronicler Henry Knighton wrote, "So great was the mortality that scarcely 1 in 10 remained alive. Parents fled from their children, husbands from wives. The bonds of love and faith were broken. Even the clergy turned on one another. Some priests refused to hear confessions for fear of infection. Others demanded payment to bury the dead. The church's moral authority, once unshakable, began to crumble. In desperation, people turned to superstition. Groups of flagellants appeared in towns across Europe, men who marched barefoot, whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. They chanted hymns of sorrow and repentance, believing their suffering would appease God's wrath. In England, the movement was smaller but no less fervent. At night, in the countryside, people gathered around fires, praying and weeping, promising to change their lives if only God would spare them. But the plague showed no mercy. In Norwich, once the second largest city in England, 3/4 of the population died within months. In York, the great minster rang its bells until the last of its cannons fell. In Lincolnshire, fields lay untended for so long that wildflowers grew where wheat once stood. The survivors began to question everything they had been taught. Why had God spared some and not others? Why had priests and kings fallen alongside peasants? The world no longer made sense. The psychological toll was as great as the physical. Those who survived often spoke of madness, of hearing the voices of the dead, of seeing ghosts in their homes. People began to believe that the plague was not of this world, but a visitation from hell itself. One chronicler wrote, "The earth was as if unpeopled, and none dared to mourn too loudly, lest death hear and return." By the end of the year, the plague had spread across all of southern England. Only the far north remained untouched for now. The king's messengers brought him reports from every corner of the realm. In Cornwall, whole villages vanished. In Kent, the monks of Canterbury Abbey died where they prayed. In London, the dead outnumbered the living. Edward ordered more prayers, more processions, but even the faith of the nation was faltering. In the silence of the cathedrals, people began to ask, if this was God's punishment, what sin could justify such ruin? The first winter of the plague fell over England like a shroud. Fires burned in the streets, not for warmth, but to clear the air. The snow turned gray with ash. No laughter, no songs, no bells, only the wind over the empty fields. In the darkness of that winter, the old world was dying. And though the people could not yet see it, something entirely new was struggling to be born. The plague had devoured the country. From the southern ports to the inland towns, it consumed everything it touched. The cities were hollowed out, their streets filled with the sound of carts carrying the dead. The countryside was littered with abandoned villages. In some places, only a handful of families remained. In the early months of the year, the pestilence reached Oxford and Cambridge, the great centers of learning. The scholars who had fled to the countryside carried it with them, spreading the disease even further. Both universities closed. The libraries were sealed. The bells of St. Mary's, once used to summon students to lecture, tolled only for the dead. In York and Lincoln, the great cathedrals stood nearly empty. The choristers who once filled them with song were gone. The bishops who survived retreated to their estates, leaving the cities to their fate. Across the realm, the church, that eternal institution that had defined life for centuries, was breaking apart. The priests who remained alive worked until they dropped, blessing the dead, anointing the sick, burying the uncounted. Some tried to maintain dignity, performing mass with trembling hands before congregations of a dozen survivors. Others abandoned their faith entirely, fleeing their parishes for fear of infection. One chronicler wrote bitterly that, "The sheep are without shepherds, and the shepherds without God." In the smaller parishes, where no priests survived, people buried their dead without rites. They dug shallow pits and threw in bodies wrapped in linen, whispering their own prayers over them. Children buried parents. Wives buried husbands. Gravediggers died where they worked, and their bodies were thrown into the same pits they had dug. Even the monasteries, those sanctuaries of silence and devotion, were not spared. In the great Benedictine Abbey of St. Albans, half the monks were dead by February. The survivors closed the gates and sealed themselves inside, praying that isolation might save them. But death came through the gates anyway, in the fleas of the monastery's own cats and dogs. By March, England was unrecognizable. The rhythms of life that had governed the realm for generations, planting, harvest, markets, fairs, had stopped entirely. The fields lay empty. Crops withered where they stood. The roads were quiet except for the occasional traveler, a lonely figure moving through the mist. The plague did not strike evenly. Some towns were wiped out completely. Others were spared by chance. The coastal ports were hit hardest, where the air was damp and trade constant. Inland, small hamlets sometimes survived untouched, only to be wiped out weeks later when a traveler arrived. There was no logic to it. The people began to say that death had grown tired of fairness. In London, what little remained of government had collapsed. The city officials were dead. The mayor's office stood empty. The courts no longer met. When Parliament tried to reconvene in Westminster, too few lords remained alive to form a quorum. The machinery of the kingdom, its laws, its taxes, its armies, had simply stopped. Edward III, isolated in Windsor, could do little more than issue decrees that no one was left to enforce. His once mighty court was reduced to a handful of attendants. The royal kitchens were empty, the great halls silent. The king's letters from this period are brief, almost desperate. In one he begged God to restore his mercy to this realm, for we are as sheep without a shepherd. Amma, when word reached him that both his sons, William of Hatfield and Thomas of Windsor, had died, the king shut himself away for days. The chroniclers say he refused to eat, that he sat by the window watching the snow fall on the castle grounds. For a man who had faced battle and rebellion without fear, the sight of his children taken by an invisible enemy broke something inside him. Even the Black Prince, his eldest son and heir, withdrew from public life. The prince, once the symbol of England's future, was haunted by the deaths around him. The court chroniclers wrote that his laughter was silenced, his sword unused. The queen, Philippa of Hainaut, tried to comfort her husband, but she too feared for their remaining children. The royal family kept strict isolation, allowing no visitors. Servants left food outside their doors. It was said that Edward's once splendid court had turned into a monastery of mourning. Beyond the palace walls, the people were turning against one another. With no priests to guide them and no laws to restrain them, superstition filled the void. Some believed the plague was caused by bad air or by the alignment of planets. Others blamed foreigners, lepers, or beggars. Across Europe, Jewish communities were slaughtered by mobs who accused them of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg, more than 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day. England, having expelled its Jewish population decades earlier, turned its rage elsewhere. Foreign traders were attacked in London. Travelers were beaten and driven from towns. Fear made monsters of men. In the countryside, whole villages burned their own houses, convinced that fire would cleanse the air. Others lit great bonfires at night, believing the smoke would drive away the plague. The sky above England glowed red for weeks from the flames of despair. Physicians continued their futile efforts. They carried charms, drank vinegar, and prescribed absurd remedies: roasted apples mixed with spices, bloodletting, or even crushed emeralds dissolved in wine. A physician named John of Burgundy wrote a treatise claiming that the heart must be comforted with sweet smells and cheerful company. He was dead within a month. The university doctors of Paris sent letters advising people to avoid sleep, baths, and sadness. The irony was not lost on those who buried them soon after. Amid this chaos, a few men and women tried to preserve what humanity remained. The friars of the Order of St. Francis tended to the sick, knowing they would die. In London, a handful of priests continued to walk the streets at night, ringing small bells to announce their presence as they carried the sacraments to the dying. People would open their doors just long enough to receive absolution before the priest collapsed on their doorstep. The dead were everywhere. Outside London, in the fields of Smithfield and Charterhouse, new burial grounds were opened. Men worked day and night with picks and shovels, throwing bodies into trenches that stretched for hundreds of feet. The earth was too cold to dig deep, so the corpses were layered with quicklime to speed decay. Some were buried still clutching rosaries, others with coins in their mouths, payment for the ferrymen, who would carry their souls across the river of death. And still, the bodies came. In Norwich, so many died that the city ran out of wood for coffins. The dead were wrapped in straw mats or sheets, dragged through the streets, and dumped outside the walls. In Canterbury, the cathedral chapter collapsed. Pilgrimages ceased. Even the shrine of Thomas Becket, once the holiest site in England, stood empty. By late spring, the plague had reached the northern counties, Derbyshire, Lancashire, Yorkshire. The people there had heard of it for months, but no warning could prepare them for the reality. The sickness struck suddenly and without mercy. In York, the records of the minster show that entire families vanished within a week. The scribes stopped writing halfway through sentences. In the Highlands of Scotland, the plague followed the merchants and soldiers returning from England. Chronicles describe towns abandoned to wolves. The borderlands, once filled with raids and feuds, fell silent. It seemed to many that the world itself was ending. The Chronicles of Henry Knighton describe visions and omens, comets streaking across the sky, strange lights over the sea, and storms that raged for days without cause. Whether these were real or imagined, they reflected a truth that the people no longer believed in tomorrow. The Church, overwhelmed by death, began to run out of answers. The Pope in Avignon, Clement VI, issued new indulgences promising that those who died of the plague would go straight to heaven. He ordered fires to burn around his palace day and night to purify the air. Even the Vicar of Christ, the most powerful man in the spiritual world, hid from the same invisible enemy as everyone else. In England, Edward III followed suit. He proclaimed that anyone who repented sincerely before death would be forgiven of all sin. He also declared that land and property could pass to surviving women and children without royal approval, a desperate attempt to keep the social fabric from collapsing entirely. But even these royal decrees could not fill the empty fields or resurrect the dead. The survivors emerged from their houses like ghosts, blinking in the sunlight. The roads were overgrown, the markets silent. The bells no longer rang, for there were no bell ringers left. Dogs roamed freely. The fields were filled with weeds taller than a man. And yet, in the ruins, life began to stir again. Those who had survived were changed forever. They had seen their families, their friends, their faith torn apart. The fear of death no longer ruled them. The world that had once seemed unshakable, the rule of kings, the power of the church, the chains of feudal duty, had been broken. In that silence, a new world waited to be born. The year was not yet over, and the plague had not yet released its grip. But the survivors could already sense it. The age that had begun in gold and glory was ending in ashes. The proud kingdom of Edward III was gone. What remained was something raw, fragile, and uncertain. The beginning of something that no one yet had words for. And above the empty fields and ruined towns, the bells of England were silent. By the spring of 1349, England had lost its voice. The great bells that once braided the day with bronze lauds, prime, tears to compline, hung mute in their towers. Across the shires, a grey veil of smoke drifted from parish to parish, the smell of ash and lime and something final, clinging to wool and hair and prayer books alike. Roads forgot the sound of cartwheels. Fields grew long, ditch and furrow gone to nettle. The old rhythm, sowing, harvest, worship, war, faltered, then stopped. Within Windsor's cold stone, a smaller silence answered the greater. Doors were left ajar that had never been left so. Platters set down and nudged forward with a sleeve, instead of handed from palm to palm. Servants vanished between dusk and dawn, leaving beds unmade, hearths unbanked. Courtiers traded courtesies for distance. The music rooms where lutes once answered one another now held the creak and sigh of timber. Even laughter, when it occurred, sounded like sacrilege. Edward, who had read God's favor and banners and trumpet calls at Crecy and Calais, stood in a chamber glazed with frost and counted the emptiness. For years his victories had felt like confirmations. The just king lifted by Providence, England entering a new Arthurian noon. Now he woke to the scrape of wind through arrow slits and the cough in a far corridor, and faith tasted of dust. News still came, though it came limping. Sheriffs wrote of towns gone dark, of churchyards filled to their hedgerows, of juries that could not be sworn because there were not 12 living men in 100. Bishops begged for clergy to bury the clergy. Messengers reached the gate with fever bright on their cheeks, and left the same day wrapped in sailcloth. The chancery clerks in Westminster began to leave whole leaves blank in the rolls where parishes had been, the kingdom's memory gaping like a jaw with missing teeth. Then, the hinge upon which the year turned, word that both of the king's youngest sons, William of Hatfield and Thomas of Windsor, were dead. William sickened first. He was still small enough to climb into his father's lap at supper and steal the choicest bit of meat, laughing through his apology. Fever took him in 3 days, a bright, terrible heat, then the swellings under the jaw, then the rattling breath. Physicians burned rosemary and rue, let blood, warmed wine with cinnamon and prayers. The queen sang psalms in a voice that frayed toward morning. None of it mattered. Thomas followed, as if pulled by a string, repeating the same steps in a smaller echo. They were buried quickly, quietly, in the chapel yard. No perfumes of frankincense, no choristers in white, no slow procession of banners and black hoods. 2 short tolls from the bell, and the thud of spade on wood. Edward watched from above, a figure half seen beyond leaded glass. He gripped the sill until his knuckles blanched and learned a new species of pain, deeper than iron through flesh. Chroniclers would note that he withdrew into his rooms for weeks, eating little, speaking less. They could not note the moments when his hands reached for the habit of a blessing and stopped midway, or the time he turned to tell a joke to a boy who was not there. He had believed the Lord had ridden with him beneath the oriflammes. Now, kneeling with his forehead to cold stone, he wondered if that favor had been withdrawn. In the Gospels, chastisement followed sin, and restoration followed contrition. Which sin was this vast? Which contrition sufficient? He ordered what he could. Each church, every church that still had a bell and a hand to pull it, was to ring at noon. Let each man and woman kneel where they stood, he wrote, and beg mercy. Fasts on Fridays, processions on holy days, relics carried barefoot through the streets. Yet where processions formed, they often turned to funerals halfway down the lane. Where relics were shown, the congregation shrank by nightfall. The Pope's indulgences arrived from Avignon with seals bright as coins, promising release to those who died in the pestilence. They gathered dust on chancels where there was no priest left to read them aloud. Within the court, the veneer cracked. Food dwindled not for want of coin but of hands. Trade, which had kept England's heart quick, slowed to a crawl. The wharves at Bristol and Southampton were empty scaffolds for gulls. The wool trade, that steady river of fleece to Flanders, congealed in barns and on sheep that no one sheared. The exchequer's chest stood open not with plenty but with pleading. Alms to fund, bodies to bury, annuities to honor with revenues that no longer arrived. In April, Edward convened what remained of his council, not at Westminster, where the air was said to be foul, but at Windsor, at a table stretched with bowls of vinegar to sweeten their breath and cleanse the room by scent if not by science. The lords sat far apart. Servants carried words between them like cautious ferrymen. The king's advisers urged him to flee north, to isolate utterly until the pest passed, to save the crown, if the body of the realm could not be saved. "This is my kingdom," he said. It is recorded that he said it softly, and if it dies, I will die with it. Outside the walls, England died in places and refused death in others. Durham took flame on the hill where they burned their dead to clean the air. Newcastle's quays fell quiet. The sickness crossed the marches into Scotland, as if borders were ink. In Canterbury, the prior lay among his monks in one long trench. In Ely, a bishop's palace stood with shutters banging open and shut to no hand. Cambridge, shuttered the year before, remained empty. A scholar who fled by a back lane carried the pest to the cottage that housed him, and kindled 3 funerals on the same road. Taxes could not be gathered from men who did not exist. Courts could not sit without jurors, nor jails be kept with jailers dead. Sheriffs sent a few reports, and then none. Clerks placed blank space after blank space where names ought to be, and discovered that blankness itself can accuse. Edward tried governance as one tries a door that may yet open. He sent letters to the surviving bishops commanding prayers and processions. He ordered ordinations without delay, or the old hurdles of training. Better an unlearned priest than none at all, one royal writ read. It was law bent by necessity into mercy. But the people had turned inward and downward. They lit candles in their kitchens, knelt in fields with caps crushed in hand, whispered rosaries without beads. They prayed and waited their turn. Summer came, and the pest did not release. The roads to London were hedged with abandoned carts and the bones of teams. Inns had their doors nailed from within. Those who still traveled, carrying letters bearing the king's seal promising immunity or mercy, or simply a right to pass, were pelted with stones from behind hedges by villagers who feared any footfall from beyond their line of sight. The economy, which is to say the life of buying and making and selling, that feeds bellies as surely as bread, disintegrated. The ports filled with empty warehouses. The Thames carried more debris than Hull. The wool that once underwrote England's wealth stayed as a weatherproofing on a living sheep's back. The few bakers who opened their shutters charged triple and sold out by prime. Hunger followed pestilence, as shadow follows man. Food was scarce, not because the earth could not be made to yield, but because there were too few hands to coax it. Grain rotted in barns for want of watchmen and turners. In some parishes, dogs learned the way to the pits and needed to be driven off with poles. In others, men learned the way to the dog's habits and took to scavenging as beasts do. Mercy is not an endless purse. The royal almoners did what they could until their ledgers began to look like prayers. From ruin, a strange liberty sprouted. A serf woke and found his lord a fortnight dead, and his lord's heir buried on the same day as the reeve. He went to the field, took up the plough, and no voice commanded him to stop. Whole manors, long held by parchment and inherited oath, slid into the hands that could hold them. Survivors took the land like breath. The land is free, they said in some places, only half in anger, and for moments at a time, it was true. The great men who remained alive wrote letters dense with grievance and plea. They begged to import laborers from other shires, to fix wages, to forbid flight. Edward, overwhelmed and seeing the hazard if every valley set its own price for survival, issued temporary passes for movement, where passes might calm trouble, and then, as the summer deepened and fear of social unmaking joined fear of death, turned grief into law. In August he signed the Ordinance of Labourers. The ink dried slowly in the damp. The ordinance decreed that all able men and women were to work at the wages known before the pestilence, that no man was to refuse honest employ, that no master was to tempt a neighbor's plowman with silver or promise. Laborers were not to flee their parishes in search of higher pay. It was a statute crafted to hold a world in place, to bind again the bonds death had loosed. In parchment, it was precise. In practice, there were too few sheriffs to nail it to doors, too few constables to shout it in markets not yet brave enough to open, and the survivors, quick with the arithmetic of scarcity, saw that their hands were dear and argued accordingly. Yet the law spoke the king's fear, not only that the realm might starve, but that obedience itself might have died, that subjects, having seen the equality of grave pits, would refuse to bend to anyone's will but God's, and even God's seemed distant. If the church once held the realm's spine straight, it now trembled. Thousands of clergy were gone. In many parishes there was no one to lift bread into blessing. In some there was no one to lift the dead. The Pope sent indulgences generous as rain. The parchment shone, and the wax was thick. But comfort lies not in seals so much as in hands. Rumor said that bishops had fled. Rumor said that monks had locked their gates and sung to empty cloisters. Rumor is not judgment, but it can be a tide. People muttered that perhaps the shepherds had lied, or if not lied, then failed. In London and Norwich, a few priests demanded coin beyond custom for last rites, claiming hazard as their wage. Word rose like smoke, and a rectory or two rose into flame as well. Men who had once crossed themselves when a friar passed now spat as they turned aside. Across the narrow sea came another spectacle. Bands of flagellants, barebacked, in sackcloth, chanting the miserere while scourging their own shoulders until the cobbles ran. Rome condemned them as disorder, as vanity, as heresy thinly veiled. Condemnation had to cross water at a ship's pace. By late summer, small groups appeared at Dover, at Canterbury, and then in London. They walked in pairs through lanes where windows were shuttered, singing until their voices broke. A few English clergy joined them, out of zeal or despair or both. Crowds gathered, because crowds always gather when pain is performed. Some watched, some wept, some followed, some laughed. The bishops warned the king that such exhibitions undermined holy order. The king forbade public penance without ecclesiastical leave. The orders were posted on doors and read by men who had already made up their minds. Edward's grief narrowed and deepened into endurance. He woke, he listened to the day's inventory of loss, and he gave such orders as could be obeyed. He stood by the queen as she sent cloth and bread into the town, and was glad that someone in the palace could still occupy herself with the arithmetic of kindness. He read letters from Lincolnshire. The land lies idle. None remain to sow or reap. And from Cornwall, the mines are silent. There is no one to drive the mules. And from York, the chapter is reduced to 4. He answered as king and as man, often with the same closing, miserere nobis domine. The phrase began to feel less like policy and more like breath. He would not quit Windsor. Physicians urged him to travel toward cleaner air, to enclose himself with a few attendants on a northern estate until winter's cold had for a time slowed the contagion. He refused. A crown cannot be quarantined, he said once, and then, when alone, thought, nor can a father's grief. The castle had become a fortress of absence. To leave it felt like abandonment of vigil. In June, he ordered the feast of St. George kept at Windsor, a thin rite to thicken courage. Once the garter had blazed there with silk and plate, now a few dozen souls gathered, each at a distance, the chaplain's homily short, the responses quieter than any tournament hush. The chronicler who set it down wrote, "The king remains steadfast, though the land perishes around him," a sentence both true and insufficient. Summer turned the smell thicker. From the Breccia, the king could trace the river by the faint shine of it, dull as pewter under a sky filmed with smoke. In the west some nights, a sudden bloom of flame would mark a village burning its dead houses, a householder tossing his own table on his own pyre, and standing back with his cap in his hands. He watched and imagined the stubbornness it took to light what once housed your laughter, and he was not sure whether to call that stubbornness grief, or cleansing, or rage. He sent riders with writs that remitted taxes in places most stricken. He sent safe conducts for merchants willing to risk the Thamesquays again. He sent commands to reopen markets in guarded fashion, and to flog the first man caught thieving a neighbor's loaf. He received fewer replies than he sent. A kingdom's sinews had been cut. Orders travel by horse, and horses die. By late summer the pest's hand loosened. It did not lift. The plague rarely ends so much as grows bored, but the pressure eased. The bell at Windsor, silent most days save to toll the dead, rang once for mass again. In a lane below the castle, a smith opened his forge and blew into the coals and laughed once at the absurdity of laughing. Smoke rose that smelled of iron instead of flesh. Men noticed, then pretended not to notice, then noticed again. Life proceeds by a series of small denials followed by admissions. Edward emerged from his seclusion, thinner, grayer, scoured. Chroniclers spoke of a man whom grief had carved hollow, and if the metaphor is imprecise, it is in this instance. Apartment, his hair had paled like a banner long in sun. His walk had become that of one who expects floors to shift underfoot. He summoned his council again. Fewer than half came. They spoke as if sound itself might rouse the pest sleeping in the walls. The king asked one question: how many remain? None could answer with certainty. A realm that had held perhaps 5 million seemed, in rumor and in tally, closer to half that. The crown's intake had thinned to a poor trickle. Priests too few, serfs too few, merchants too few. England, for the first time in centuries, felt like a kingdom without the old scaffolding of order. "If God has chosen to humble us," he said at last, "then let us learn humility." He ordered a national fast, not triumph, but thanksgiving for those spared, and intercession for the countless not spared. He proclaimed a day in November for universal supplication and remembrance, to be held each year thereafter while memory yet persisted. It was a good order. and it spread slowly, and in some places men with no priest said the prayers aloud to one another, and in some places there was no one to hear them. He turned next to the church. Of all his pillars, it had suffered most. Whole chapters gone, entire houses of brothers reduced to 2 or 3 men who bickered from fatigue. He authorized ordinations with little schooling, begged the papal legate to widen dispensations, wrote to Clement to allow monastery lands to aid widows and orphans. Clement's replies carried sympathy and the mild despair of a shepherd whose flock is scattered to the horizon. Europe had few spare priests to lend a neighbor. Rome continued to issue indulgences, releasing the plague dead from purgatory. Some read them with tears, some nailed them to beams as talismans. Many wrapped bread in them, and found even grace paper serves to keep loaves from going stale. None of it moved grain from barn to oven. The harvest of 1,349 was poor where it happened at all. Bread ran dear. In some shires, people boiled acorns. In others, horseflesh. The king's officials wrote from Lincolnshire with lines that sounded like sermon. The land lies idle. None remain to sow or reap. Hunger follows pestilence as shadow follows man. The ports, Bristol, Southampton, stayed uneasy. The Thames learned again the silhouettes of a few cautious cogs, then forgot them for weeks at a time. Merchants kept their cargoes tight to their chests, and their chests tight to their hearths. Banditry learned boldness on roads with no sheriffs riding them. Edward ordered new surveys of the realm, not the grand tally of doomsday, but a thin copy. Who stands, who can be taxed, where wagons can pass. Officers returned with tables whose whiteness outnumbered their ink, and with notes that were excuses and laments. No men here to count. Counters taken sick before finishing. Village vanished. Chroniclers began to use phrases like the age of desolation, and did not feel they exaggerated. But ruin's field breeds its own crop. Among the young especially, those who had seen death make sport of lords and ploughmen alike, a cool independence took root. They spoke more freely in alehouses, joked more sharply about bishops, asked aloud questions their fathers had not framed. They weighed a king's command against their own hunger, and did the math. It was not yet rebellion. It was rehearsal, with the stage unbuilt. In the autumn, when the ground hardens and breath steams, Edward wrote a slow progress through a portion of what had once been a realm, and now looked like an argument. Windsor to Westminster, and back through Canterbury. Everywhere the same palette, half-ruined churches, houses with doors unlatched to rooms empty of furniture, fields green where they ought to have been brown with stubble. In some villages, a handful of families still stood to watch him pass, and fell to their knees. Not in acclamation exactly, but in exhaustion. Their heads bowed as if from habit. Their eyes stayed up and direct. In Canterbury he entered the great nave. It had that particular stale sweetness of places long closed, beeswax and old incense. Dust lay on the shrine of Thomas Becket, as if even miracles had been set aside. The monks who remained had the hollow eyes of men who sleep too little to dream. They told him of relics carried through streets and no wonders, of prayers said until language itself felt like toil. Edward knelt before the high altar and said nothing. He prayed for sons who could no longer hear him, for subjects he would never see, for forgiveness he was not sure how to deserve. He stayed until his knees ached and his spine complained, and his head felt light with blood hunger. Then he rose, and though his face was pale, his eyes were steadier than they had been in months. He began to speak of rebuilding. Westminster's council, thinned but working, drafted edicts to reopen ports, suspended taxes in the worst-struck hundreds, invited foreign merchants back with promises of protection and remission. They offered good safe conducts to men willing to work the empty lands, and thin ones to men of dubious character whom, in other years, they might have hanged. Commerce flickered like a rushlight in a draught, lit, guttered, lit again. By Advent, a few ships from Flanders and the Hanseatic towns found their way up the Thames and took on wool enough to make one ledger smile. Markets reopened in London with a caution that looked like cowardice, until one remembered what courage had cost. Bread and ale returned to the lanes in portions that felt like grace, and were paid for as if they were. The scars remained everywhere, as scars tend to. At Windsor, the royal household gathered for a small rite in memory of the dead princes. No choirs, only a psalm. Edward laid a hand on the shoulder of his surviving son, the Black Prince, and spoke the only words of hope he trusted. "We must live for those who cannot." A clerk wrote them with a plain pen. The ink dried the same as it would for any sentence. And yet memory insists the line is underlined. Letters grew briefer as the year closed, not because there was less to say, but because saying changes nothing. Many ended with the same Latin Edward had come to favor, miserere nobis domine. The phrase had become the year's shape, as recognizable as harvest once had been. By the last days of 1349, the fury had begun to fade. The cold came down from the north, as if it had been sent. It did not stop the pest entirely. There are always outliers, stubborn as men, but it slowed its stride. Survivors appeared in streets where no foot had sounded for months. Men drove plows again through furrows stiff as iron. Children played games without counting how many players they began with, and how many would be left by dusk. The bells, so long conscripted to toll the dead, dared mark mass again. A city that had been a grave remembered it was also a body. In the royal chapel, Edward sat beside Philippa while a small choir sang. He had not wept in public since the day they buried William and Thomas. He did not weep now, but his head bowed not in collapse but in prayer. He gave thanks not for victory. He had learned the poverty of that word this year, but for endurance. Later, a chronicler would write that the king's eyes filled at a high note, that for a moment it seemed as if the angels had returned to England. Perhaps they had not. Perhaps the choir boys had simply remembered how to breathe together. Grace is sometimes indistinguishable from competence restored. That night snow fell over Windsor, light as blown ash, settling on battlements and the black backs of ravens. The king stood at his window. Below, the fields where his sons had once run lay silver and still. Torches along the ward flickered in the wind. Somewhere down in the lower court, a guard stamped his feet and hummed a fragment of a tune. Edward clasped his hands behind his back. He had buried children, friends, and certainties. He had watched belief itself become a problem with no answer he could love. He had learned that kingship is a small tool against a vast sorrow, and that a small tool is not nothing. The bell of Windsor rang faintly through the snow. It startled him not with fear, but with the recognition that sound could be itself again. The year was ending. The Black Death had broken the world, and yet the world, like a patient who sleeps at last after fever, breathed. He spoke a sentence meant for no chronicler and no court. "Lord, let this silence be peace." The words did not glow. No voice answered. He kept watch anyway, a man awake in the dark, in a house that still stands. From that silence, a new England would one day rise, not triumphant, not pure, not even sure of itself, but moving. For now, it was enough that December's frost had slowed the tally of graves, and that a king who had endured the unimaginable still found reason to stand at the window and count the living. The year 1350 began not with joy, but with exhaustion. The plague had loosened its grip, yet the world it left behind was steeped in dread. Across England, the survivors lived in the shadow of death. They had buried their families, burned their homes, and watched their priests fall. They had survived the end of the world, but survival brought no peace. The bells that had tolled without pause now rang only on Sundays, hesitant and weary. The people returned to their churches, but their prayers were hollow. Faith had not vanished. It had fractured. The old certainty that God watched and guided his people had been replaced by confusion. Why had the innocent died and the wicked lived? Why had the clergy perished and the beggars endured? No priest, no bishop, no king could answer. In the countryside, the people turned to their own explanations. They whispered that the air was cursed, that unseen spirits had carried the disease through the wind. Others said it was punishment not for England's sins, but for the pride of Europe itself. The stories spread faster than sermons. Villages lit fires at their borders. Great rings of flame meant to keep the sickness away. In towns, barrels of pitch were burned in the streets day and night. The smoke blackened the sky, choking the survivors. Yet they believed it kept death from their doors. Some burned herbs, rosemary, lavender, or sage, hoping the smell would drive away the bad air. Others burned their dead outright, unwilling to risk another graveyard filled to overflowing. The king's ministers recorded strange reports. In one parish in Kent, The villagers set fire to their own church, claiming it had been defiled by death. In another, in Devon, a group of farmers surrounded their village with torches and swore that no stranger would enter until a full year had passed. Fear had become the new faith. Edward III's government, though barely functioning, issued edicts urging calm. The king ordered fires to be lit under royal supervision, incense burned in every church, and processions of thanksgiving held to mark the end of the pestilence. But the people no longer listened to proclamations. They listened to the voices in their own hearts, voices of guilt, fear, and desperation. In the north, some took to more violent forms of penance. Groups of men and women gathered in the streets, chanting prayers and whipping themselves until their backs ran red. They called themselves the Brethren of the Cross. The movement had begun years earlier on the continent, the Flagellants, who had marched across Germany and France, claiming that through their suffering, they could purify the world. Now they had come to England. In Canterbury, the first procession appeared in March. Barefoot and half-naked, they walked through the city in silence. With every toll of the bell, they struck themselves with cords tipped in iron. Blood fell like rain on the cobblestones. Behind them followed the crowd, merchants, peasants, even monks, chanting the psalms of mercy. The church's bishops were horrified. They condemned the Flagellants as blasphemers, warning that self-punishment without confession was rebellion against God. But for the common people, who had seen priests die like everyone else, the Flagellants seemed closer to heaven than any bishop. In London, small groups began to form their own processions, defying both king and clergy. They walked by night through the narrow lanes, carrying crosses, torches, and scourges. They believed that England must atone, or the plague would return. When word reached Windsor, Edward ordered the movement suppressed. He instructed the Archbishop of Canterbury to preach against them. The sermons thundered from pulpits across the land. Man cannot save himself by blood but by obedience. Yet few believed. The people were beyond obedience. The plague had broken the hierarchy of belief just as it had broken the hierarchy of power. Men no longer saw the world as a ladder from peasant to priest to king to God. They saw it as a circle, one that death had flattened. This new world was filled with strange contradictions. The survivors were both terrified and reckless. Some renounced all pleasure, living as hermits in the woods. Others, convinced that life could end at any moment, plunged into sin, drinking, gambling, and fornication. The moral order of the realm unraveled as quickly as the social one. Chroniclers from the time describe scenes of wild contrast. A funeral procession passing a tavern filled with laughter. Priests preaching repentance while merchants sold indulgences. Nobles donating land to the church one day and seizing it back the next. England had become a land of paradox, half faith, half despair. The Church of Rome struggled to restore control. Pope Clement VI, still ruling from Avignon, issued decrees promising remission of sins for those who performed acts of charity. He urged priests to teach hope instead of fear, but his words reached England too late and carried little weight. The papacy itself was tainted by whispers of corruption. People said the Pope had survived the plague only because he had surrounded himself with fire and gold. And so the people followed their own popes, prophets, and wanderers, who claimed visions of the Virgin, who preached in marketplaces, who warned that England's sins would bring another wave of death. Some claimed to hear the voice of God in the thunder. Others claimed to see angels over the graves. In Cornwall, one man declared himself the new John the Baptist and led his followers into the sea, promising that the salt water would wash away their guilt. None returned. Edward, though still devout, saw danger in these movements. He feared not their theology, but their power. Unchecked faith was as dangerous as no faith at all. He instructed his sheriffs to arrest self-proclaimed prophets and punish anyone spreading panic. Yet the crown's reach was weak. Many sheriffs refused, saying there were not enough men left to keep order. The king's authority had never seemed so fragile. The economy, already broken by the plague, was sliding into chaos. With so many dead, the cost of labor soared. Food prices tripled. Merchants demanded higher payments for imports from France and Flanders. The treasury, depleted by years of war and plague, could not bear the strain. The crown attempted to restore stability by imposing price controls, but the measures failed. Local officials ignored them, either out of corruption or fear. Inflation spread across the realm. A loaf of bread that had once cost a penny now cost 3. A cow that had sold for 10 shillings now sold for 30. And in the midst of scarcity, the people turned on one another. In Bristol, mobs looted granaries, accusing the millers of hoarding grain. In York, peasants stormed the bishop's storehouses and distributed the food themselves. Edward ordered the punishment of all those who steal in the name of charity, but few arrests were made. The sheriffs themselves were often among the hungry. The crown began to fear rebellion. The Black Death had not only reduced the population, it had unchained it. The peasants who remained were no longer submissive. They demanded better pay, shorter service, freedom from the Lord's control. Their courage came not from arrogance, but from survival. They had faced death and endured. They no longer feared anything. In many manners, lords were forced to offer wages or watch their fields lie fallow. In others, peasants simply took over the land and declared it their own. The word freeman, once reserved for a privileged few, began to spread among the people like a blessing. Edward's counselors saw this as the greatest threat to the kingdom since the plague itself. Without order, they warned, there could be no England. But how could a king restore order when even God seemed to have abandoned his? By mid-year, the hysteria reached its peak. Across Europe, panic turned to violence. In Strasbourg, the Jewish population, accused falsely of poisoning wells, was massacred. Over 2,000 men, women, and children were dragged to a wooden platform and burned alive while the city watched. In the months that followed, similar atrocities spread through Switzerland and France. England, though spared from such pogroms by the absence of Jews since their expulsion in 1290, was not free from bloodshed. Foreigners, Flemish traders, Lombard bankers, became targets. They were accused of carrying bad air in their clothes or devil dust in their wares. In London, an Italian merchant was beaten to death in the marketplace. His body was left hanging for days as a warning to others. The church preached against such violence, but its sermons rang hollow. For years it had failed to protect the innocent. Now its words were just another echo in a broken world. Meanwhile, the fear of divine wrath led to extremes of piety. In some parishes, priests organized mass baptisms, believing that washing away sin would prevent future plague. Thousands gathered along the Thames and in the streams of the Midlands. Parents dipped their children into icy water while chanting prayers for protection. The practice spread so fast that the bishops themselves grew alarmed. One warned that those who would drown the devil may drown their own souls. But his words were lost in the flood of faith. Even physicians, those who claimed to follow reason, resorted to ritual. They prescribed not only herbs but prayers, recommending that patients sleep surrounded by candles or inhale the smoke of blessed incense. Some wrote that standing near fire would purge the humors of corruption. The Pope himself, Clement VI, was said to have survived by keeping fires burning in his chambers day and night. And so, from London to Lincoln, people began to build circles of fire around their homes at night, believing the flames would keep the plague away. The glow of burning pitch filled the sky, turning England into a land of trembling light. Fire, fear, and faith, the trinity of the new age. The world had lost its reason, but it had not lost its hope. Even in madness, there was meaning. People needed to believe that they could do something, anything, to hold back the darkness. By late summer of 1350, the hysteria began to ebb. The fires still burned, but more for comfort than for protection. The processions of flagellants grew smaller. The people, exhausted by their own fears, turned once more to the routines of survival, to the harvest, to the rebuilding of homes, to the slow return of trade. Edward III, watching from Windsor, began to see a pattern in the madness. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that a kingdom could not survive on fear alone. The people needed order not divine but human. And so, while the villagers prayed and the priests chanted, the king began to plan. A new order was coming. It would be born not of faith, but of law. By the end of 1350, the flames that had once lit every village in England began to die down. The fire that had been meant to drive away sickness had become a symbol of something else, of how far faith could burn before it turned to ash. The plague was gone, but its shadow remained, smoldering in the hearts of those who had survived. Across the countryside, people slowly began to return to their old routines. The harvest that year was good, perhaps the best in a decade. The fields of wheat and barley swayed golden in the wind, the same fields that had been filled with weeds and bones a year before. But even as life returned, the people who worked those fields were not the same. They labored quietly, without song or laughter, their eyes watchful, their prayers private. They had learned that death could come without warning, and that no priest or king could stop it. In the churches, attendance was sparse. Many of the old clergy were gone, and the new ones, hastily ordained, often uneducated, commanded little respect. Parishioners came more out of habit than conviction. The hymns were sung softly, the sermons short. The great cathedrals, once filled with incense and color, now echoed like tombs. Faith had survived, but reverence had not. The bishops, desperate to regain control, issued decrees condemning false prophets, self-punishment, and unholy fires. They preached against the flagellants, against those who claimed to see visions or hear voices. But their words rang hollow. For 2 years, the church had been absent from the lives of the people. Now it tried to reclaim them, and found them changed. The king's government, too, began to realize that the realm could not be rebuilt through fear. Edward III understood that faith alone could not mend a kingdom. The chaos of the past 2 years, the mobs, the fires, the superstition, had shown him that without law, even belief would destroy itself. In October 1350, Edward summoned his council to Westminster for the first full session since before the plague. The city was still half empty, but the great hall echoed once more with the sound of voices. The air smelled of wax and smoke. The councillors sat at a distance from one another, each cautious, each marked by grief. Some wore black for the families they had lost. Edward entered without ceremony. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham, who witnessed the meeting, wrote that the king appeared aged and gaunt, but his eyes burned with purpose. He began not with speeches, but with silence. The courtiers stood, waiting for him to speak. Finally, Edward said, "We have seen death. Let us now see to the living." It was the beginning of England's return to reason. The council spent days discussing the condition of the realm. Reports from every shire were grim. Farms abandoned, rents unpaid, villages overgrown, markets still shuttered. Yet amid the devastation, one truth stood out: labor was scarce, and those who could work were demanding unprecedented wages. For centuries, the kingdom had been built on hierarchy, those who owned and those who served. But the plague had upended that order. The peasants who survived were now the masters of supply. They knew it, and they were not afraid to act upon it. Edward's lords complained bitterly that the villains refused to obey. They wrote of peasants abandoning their manors, crossing the countryside in search of higher pay. Some even taunted their former masters, shouting that all men are equal now, for death has made it so. The king listened in silence. He understood the danger. The old world had been built on obedience, on faith that kings ruled by divine right, that priests held the keys to heaven, that lords commanded by birth. But if the plague had proven anything, it was that none of those certainties held true. In the villages, men who had once bowed their heads now spoke as equals. In the cities, merchants grew wealthy while noble estates decayed. A quiet revolution had begun, born not from rebellion, but from necessity. And yet, Edward could not let it continue unchecked. A kingdom without hierarchy was a kingdom without stability. In the closing weeks of 1350, he began to plan a new law, one that would bind the survivors back to order, one that would reimpose discipline where faith had failed. It would come to be known as the Statute of Labourers, but its spirit was already forming in the king's mind, a law of control, of limits, of restoration. But before that law could be written, England had to be calmed. The fires of fear still smoldered in the countryside. The bishops still struggled to reassert their authority. To aid them, Edward declared a national day of purification for All Saints' Day, November 1st. Every church, monastery, and chapel in the realm was ordered to hold a mass for the dead, to pray for the souls lost to the pestilence, and to bless the fields for a new beginning. It was the first act of collective faith in nearly 2 years. On that morning, across the cold hills of England, bells rang once more. The sound was thin, uneven. Many churches had no bell ringers left, but it was enough. In London, people gathered in the ruins of St. Paul's. In Canterbury, a handful of monks sang before an almost empty nave. In small villages, Families knelt in their fields, praying not for salvation, but for peace. The smoke of incense rose again, mingling with the frost. The air smelled of ash and hope. That day marked the end of the great hysteria. The fires went out. The flagellants dispersed. The people began to rebuild, not out of faith in miracles, but out of sheer human will. Edward, standing in the chapel of Windsor, watched the ceremony with quiet intensity. When the final hymn was sung, he remained on his knees long after the others had gone. The chroniclers recorded his prayer: "Lord, grant us not the world we knew, but the strength to build anew." It was the most honest prayer of his reign. Yet the road to rebuilding would not be easy. The church, though humbled, sought to reclaim its authority. It demanded tithes from a population that could barely feed itself. When some refused, bishops threatened them with excommunication. Others retaliated by burning tithe barns or refusing to attend Mass. In Norwich, a riot broke out when a priest demanded payment from a widow whose sons had died of plague. The crowd dragged him from his rectory and beat him to death. In Winchester, peasants chased a bishop's steward out of town. The fear of God had turned to anger against his representatives. Edward ordered the sheriffs to restore order, but his reach was limited. The very structure of local governance had collapsed. Many sheriffs were dead or had fled their posts. In practice, England was governing itself, each village making its own peace, each town setting its own laws. In this vacuum, a new kind of leadership began to emerge, practical, not divine. Merchants formed councils to manage trade. Farmers gathered to share resources. The idea of community shifted from obedience to cooperation. It was an idea that would one day shape a nation. Meanwhile, the intellectual life of England began, slowly, to awaken again. At Oxford, the university reopened with only a fraction of its former scholars. Among them was a young theologian named John Wycliffe, who would later challenge the church itself. In these early years, he wrote that the plague was not God's curse, but his mercy, for it taught men that salvation lies not in priests, but in conscience. His words went largely unnoticed then, but they were seeds. In the silence of recovery, ideas like his took root. The plague had burned through the body of the kingdom. Now it began to burn through its mind. Even art reflected the transformation. Painters no longer filled their works with saints and angels, but with scenes of mortality. Stone carvers etched skeletons onto tombs. Music, once written for glory, turned mournful. The living sang not of victory, but of survival. The old world was gone, and everyone knew it. By December of 1350, England stood on the threshold of something new. The plague had killed half its people, destroyed its economy, and humbled its faith. But it had also cleared the ground. The survivors, peasants, merchants, nobles, and kings, faced a blank page. Edward looked upon that emptiness with both sorrow and determination. He had lost sons, friends, and faith, yet he still wore the crown. He understood now that his task was not to restore the past, but to forge something from the ruins, something that could endure the next storm. The fires of fear had burned themselves out. What remained was the cold, clear light of reason, and in that light, the king prepared to write a new law, one that would redefine England for generations. It would not be written in prayer or blood, but in ink. The age of fire had ended. The age of order was about to begin. The fire had faded, but the smoke still hung over England. The year was 1351, and the country stood between two worlds, the old, built on faith and obedience, and the new, born from loss and survival. The great pestilence had ended, yet its aftershocks rippled through every field, every street, and every soul. Edward III sat upon a throne that no longer commanded the same awe it once had. The crown remained on his head. The banners still hung in his halls, but the authority that had bound his kingdom together had been eroded by the plague. The old machinery of feudalism, that intricate web of loyalty and labor, had cracked under the weight of death. Before the Black Death, England had been a land of certainty. The serfs tilled their lords' fields. The lords swore allegiance to their king, and the church sanctified the entire order. Now, with half the population gone, that system no longer functioned. The soil was rich, but there were no hands left to work it. Estates lay empty, villages vanished, The dead had taken not only lives, but labor itself. The survivors understood their value. The peasants, freed by circumstance, began to demand higher wages, shorter hours, and better living conditions. Those who refused were ignored. They could walk away, for someone else would always need them. For the first time in centuries, the poor had power, and they knew it. In the fields of Norfolk, a man who had once been bound to his lord's manor now demanded twice his usual pay to harvest wheat. In Sussex, laborers refused to sow crops unless they were fed meat instead of barley gruel. In London, craftsmen banded together to set their own prices. The lords, long accustomed to command, were horrified. They wrote to the king that the commons grow insolent and disobedient. They will not heed their betters. Edward listened. He was a man who had built his kingdom on hierarchy, on discipline, chivalry, and divine order. To him, this new arrogance among the peasants was not only rebellion against their lords, but rebellion against God himself. The king believed that England's greatness had come from structure, from each man knowing his place. If that structure failed, so too would the realm. And so, in June of 1351, the king acted. From Westminster, Edward issued a decree that would define England for generations, the Statute of Labourers. It was a law born of fear, that the old world was slipping away. The statute began with solemn words. Because a great part of the people is dead, and some, seeing the necessity of masters and great scarcity of servants, will not serve unless they receive excessive wages, we have ordained, it went on to command, that every able-bodied person under the age of 60 must work, and only for the same wages they had earned before the plague. Laborers who refused could be imprisoned. Masters who paid higher wages could be fined. Those who left their home villages in search of better pay were to be arrested and returned. It was, in essence, an attempt to freeze time to drag England back to 1347 before the Black Death had changed everything. The king believed he was saving the kingdom. But in truth, he was trying to rebuild a world that no longer existed. The enforcement of the law was immediate and brutal. The sheriffs were ordered to travel from shire to shire, announcing the statute in every market and parish. Notices were nailed to church doors. Royal clerks kept lists of violators, laborers who demanded too much, and masters who dared to pay them. In Kent, a group of farmhands were arrested for leaving their fields without permission. In Lincolnshire, a manor owner was fined for hiring them at a higher wage. In Yorkshire, soldiers were sent to round up vagrant men who had fled their villages in search of work. But the law was impossible to enforce. There were too few officials left alive, too few jails to hold offenders. In many regions, the sheriffs themselves sympathized with the workers, knowing the hardship they had endured. Some pretended not to see. Others took bribes. The people, for their part, ignored the law. They had lived through the plague. They would not bow to parchment. The Statute of Labourers may have been royal command, but the common folk saw it as an insult, a declaration that their suffering meant nothing, that their newfound freedom was a mistake. Still, the crown pressed on. Edward believed that stability required discipline. He had survived plague, famine, and war. He could not allow chaos to reign. The statute became not just a law, but a symbol of the king's determination to reassert control, to prove that divine order could be restored. Yet beneath the surface, resentment grew. The lords and bishops applauded the law, but the peasants muttered in taverns and fields, "We have buried our masters." One chronicler recorded a laborer saying, "And yet their ghosts still command us." In towns like Norwich and Canterbury, petitions circulated demanding fair wages. The government ignored them. The tension simmered quietly, unseen but persistent, a seed that would one day bloom in rebellion. At the same time, the law had unintended consequences. By fixing wages, it forced many employers to look for other ways to attract laborers. They offered better food, shorter working hours, even small plots of land. The result was a subtle but irreversible shift. Peasants began to own property. Freedom, once unthinkable, became reality, not granted by law, but born from necessity. In this new economy, the old aristocracy weakened further. Some sold land to merchants or minor gentry. Others married into lower families to preserve their estates. The lines that had once divided England so clearly, noble, merchant, peasant, began to blur. The king did not see it yet, but the Statute of Labourers, meant to preserve order, was dismantling it. Edward's own letters from the period reveal a man torn between faith in tradition and fear of change. He wrote to his son, the Black Prince, urging him to uphold the old customs, to keep the commons in their due obedience. But he also acknowledged that the times are unlike those we have known, and the hearts of men are strange. He was right. The plague had changed not only the structure of England, but the hearts of its people. In the years after the statute, laborers continued to test its limits. Some fled to the cities, where enforcement was weaker. Others found refuge with sympathetic lords, who valued their skill more than obedience. The government responded with new measures: patrols, fines, and even branding. Those caught breaking the law could be marked on the forehead with a hot iron, the letter for fugitive. But the iron could not erase what the plague had carved into the soul of England: the knowledge that all men, high or low, shared the same flesh, the same fragility. And while the crown fought to preserve the past, the world kept moving forward. Trade slowly revived. The ports reopened. London's markets filled with Flemish cloth, Italian wine, and Baltic timber. The survivors, fewer in number but richer in opportunity, prospered. A new middle class of merchants and craftsmen began to rise, men who owed their wealth not to birth but to skill. The church, weakened and discredited, could no longer dictate morality. The king's own ministers began to speak of earthly justice rather than divine will. It was a small shift in words, but a monumental shift in thought. The Statute of Labourers, though written to preserve feudal order, had inadvertently laid the groundwork for something entirely new. A society based not on obedience, but on exchange. And with exchange came expectation. The peasants who worked for wages began to expect fair treatment. The craftsmen who sold their goods demanded protection from unfair taxes. The merchants who traded abroad wanted political influence equal to their economic power. The seeds of social reform had been sown, though no one yet dared to call them that. By the late summer of 1351, Edward could sense the tension. The countryside was restless. The people obeyed his laws outwardly, but their loyalty was thin. The lords still bowed, but their coffers were empty. The church blessed him, but its power was fading. He had restored the appearance of order, but not its spirit. And yet, for all its flaws, the Statute of Labourers endured. It became the backbone of English labor law for more than 2 centuries. Even as rebellion flared in later decades, the statute remained on the books, a relic of a time when a king, broken by plague, tried to command the living as he had commanded the dead. As the year ended, Edward rode from Westminster to Windsor. The fields along the way were green again, the villages busy with new faces. Children played where once only crows had stood. For the first time since the Great Dying, England looked alive. But to Edward's eyes, it was a different land. The men in the fields no longer doffed their caps as quickly. The women in the markets met his gaze without fear. The songs they sang were not hymns of obedience, but of endurance. He had kept his crown, but his world had changed. In the stillness of winter, as snow fell over Windsor, Edward III sat by the fire and looked into the flames. He had ruled through war, famine, and plague. He had buried his sons and half his people. He had written laws to hold back the tide, and yet the tide had risen anyway. He knew even then that history would not remember his statutes or his victories as much as it would remember what came after the awakening of a people who had seen death and learned to live. The Black Death had taken lives. The king's law would shape souls, and together they had ended the age of faith and begun the age of man. By the spring of 1352, England began to breathe again. The plague had passed, the fires had gone out, and the cries of the dying had faded into memory. In their place came a silence unlike any before, not the silence of death, but of recovery. The land was scarred, the people fewer, yet everywhere life was stirring. The air carried the smell of freshly turned soil once more. The fields that had lain fallow for years were plowed again. The sound of axes echoed through the forests as men rebuilt the homes that had rotted or burned. In the towns, smoke rose from hearths, and the chatter of trade returned to the streets. It was not joy that filled the air, but endurance, the stubborn refusal of humanity to vanish. England was a different country now. The world that had existed before 1348 of unquestioned faith, rigid hierarchy, and crowded cities was gone. In its place stood something leaner, quieter, and, in its own strange way, freer. The population had fallen to less than half of what it had been a generation earlier. In that emptiness lay both tragedy and opportunity. For those who survived, life offered more than it ever had before. A man who once served as a peasant might now rent or even own land. A widow could inherit property. Apprentices became masters overnight, their rivals buried in the plague pits. The old order, so long unyielding, had fractured. And through the cracks, a new class began to rise. Merchants, craftsmen, and laborers, once considered the lowest rungs of society, now found themselves essential. With fewer workers, wages rose. The king's laws tried to suppress them, but the reality of need could not be legislated away. Demand for skill outpaced supply, and so those who worked with their hands became valuable beyond measure. In the city of London, trade returned with a vengeance. The wool merchants of Cheapside reopened their stalls, selling English cloth to buyers from Flanders and Italy. Shipyards along the Thames began to hum again. The Hanseatic League renewed its presence in English ports. Money flowed back into the city, and with it came new ideas. Among the survivors, there was a restlessness, an energy born not of greed, but of survival. The people had seen the world collapse. They were determined to rebuild it stronger. Yet for all its progress, the kingdom bore the marks of its suffering. The fields were dotted with ruins, churches half rebuilt, villages abandoned, cottages reclaimed by ivy. Some places would never be re-inhabited. Travelers spoke of ghost towns where only the wind moved through empty doorways. In London, vast cemeteries remained sealed. The ground beneath them, swollen by countless bodies, sank unevenly. The living avoided those places, calling them God's fields. But even among such reminders of mortality, beauty began to return. The church, weakened by the loss of its clergy, sought to heal through art. Painters and sculptors were commissioned to fill the new churches with images, not of divine triumph, but of human suffering and endurance. On the walls of chapels, a new motif began to appear. Skeletons dancing hand in hand with the living. It was called the dance macabre, the dance of death. In these haunting images, kings, popes, knights, and peasants all joined the same procession, led by Death himself. It was not blasphemy, it was truth. The plague had shown that all men were equal in the grave. The dance macabre spread from France to England, from abbey to parish, until it adorned the walls of nearly every major church. To those who had survived, it was not frightening, it was comforting. It said, death comes for all, but life goes on. A chronicler from York wrote of seeing one such mural. There was no terror in it, only a kind of strange peace, for in the dance, the living and the dead held hands. This new art marked a profound change in how people saw the world. Before the plague, art had glorified heaven. Now it looked directly at earth, at human faces, human pain, human hope. It was as if the people of England had learned to find holiness, not in perfection, but in endurance. Even architecture reflected this shift. The great cathedrals, once built to exalt the divine, now stood as memorials to the dead. At Canterbury, Winchester, and York Minster, new chapels were added, smaller, humbler, dedicated not to saints but to the countless souls lost to the pestilence. Their walls bore thousands of names, carved by grieving hands. These were not the grand tombs of kings and bishops, but simple inscriptions. John, who tilled the earth; Alice, who sang in the choir; Thomas, who carried the dead. In death, the common man had finally found a place beside the noble. The church, recognizing this change, adapted reluctantly. Sermons began to speak not of eternal punishment, but of mercy. Priests, once distant, now preached compassion. The idea that all souls were equal before God gained quiet traction. A new generation of clergy, trained after the plague, approached faith differently. They were younger, often common-born, and more connected to their congregations. They had seen too much to cling to old dogma. Some preached in English rather than Latin, so that even the unlearned could understand. It was a small revolution, one that would in time reshape religion itself. Meanwhile, education slowly revived. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge, nearly emptied during the plague, reopened their halls. Many of their new students were sons of merchants and craftsmen, young men whose fathers had profited from rebuilding. Among them were thinkers who began to question not only theology, but the very structure of society. The idea that knowledge, not birth, could elevate a man was taking root. It was during these years that a quiet scholar named John Wycliffe began to teach at Oxford. He was still young, but his mind was sharp and restless. In his sermons, he hinted that the church's wealth was a corruption of faith. He suggested that Scripture, not the Pope, was the highest authority. His ideas would not blossom fully until decades later, but they were planted in the soil of a post-plague world, a soil rich with doubt and rebirth. As faith softened, commerce hardened. England was becoming a nation of trade. The middle class, a term not yet spoken, but already real, was emerging. In towns like Bristol, Norwich, and York, guilds of merchants and craftsmen grew in power. They regulated prices, trained apprentices, and provided for widows and orphans. These guilds became the backbone of the new society, filling the vacuum left by the old feudal lords. The king, ever practical, recognized their value. Edward III granted charters to the guilds, allowing them to govern themselves. In return, they pledged loyalty and taxes to the crown. It was a bargain that would shape English governance for centuries. Power traded for stability. The Statute of Labourers, though still in force, had lost much of its authority. The economy no longer obeyed royal decree. Wages continued to rise, and mobility became common. Men and women moved freely across the kingdom, in search of opportunity. For the first time, individual will, not divine order, began to determine a person's fate. In art, in trade, in faith, the same idea echoed. The worth of a man lay in his deeds, not his birth. The change was slow, subtle, and not without resistance. The nobility, though weakened, still clung to their titles. The church still demanded obedience, but neither held the same grip as before. The survivors had looked death in the eye and seen the truth that life was fragile, fleeting, and precious. That understanding changed everything, even in the small things, the way people dressed, the songs they sang, the way they celebrated. There was a difference. Bright colors returned to clothing, where once black had dominated. Music shifted from solemn chants to lively melodies. Festivals resumed, though they now carried undertones of remembrance. Every feast day was both a celebration and a memorial. The chroniclers of the time spoke of the two Englands, one of the living and one of the dead. They existed side by side. The living plowed and prayed. The dead lingered in memory, guiding their hands. In 1353, King Edward ordered the construction of new almshouses for orphans and widows, the first organized system of public charity in England's history. He also funded schools for the children of craftsmen, a radical act for a medieval monarch. It was as if the king, who had seen his kingdom broken by plague, now sought to rebuild it through education rather than conquest. Edward's own character had changed. The war with France, once his obsession, no longer consumed him. He turned his attention inward, to his people. His letters from this period are filled not with strategy, but with reflection. He wrote of mercy, of balance, of the duty of rulers to the ruled. The warrior king of Crecy had become the steward of a wounded land. The people noticed. For the first time, Edward was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a father. And yet, beneath this peace, the memory of the plague remained. It was everywhere, in art, in faith, in the very air. The survivors carried it like a scar. Children born after 1349 grew up hearing stories of the great dying. They played in fields where bones still surfaced after the rain. They learned to live with death as a familiar neighbor, but they also learned something more profound, to find meaning in survival itself. By the end of 1353, England was no longer merely recovering, it was transforming. The kingdom that had once bowed to the church now listened to merchants and thinkers. The economy that had been feudal was becoming capitalist. The faith that had been unquestioning was becoming personal. The world had burned, and from the ashes rose not despair, but awakening. In a letter to the Bishop of Winchester that year, Edward wrote, "God has tried this land by fire, and what remains is purer. "The pride of man is fallen, but his spirit endures." It was true. The Black Death had destroyed England's body, but in its ruins, the soul of a New England, questioning, creative, and alive, had begun to emerge. By 1353, England had begun to look alive again. The crops were full, the markets open, the ports busy. Yet beneath the hum of recovery lingered something deeper, a silence of memory. The Black Death was gone, but it was not forgotten. It lived on in the stories people told, in the prayers they whispered, and in the art and words that would shape the generations to come. The survivors had rebuilt their homes, but not their hearts. The world they lived in was brighter on the surface, but shadowed in the soul. The people who had seen half of humanity vanish could never again believe that life was certain, or that the order of things was unshakable. The plague had become not just a tragedy, but a teacher, and its lessons began to appear everywhere, in art, in poetry, in the way people thought about themselves and their God. In the years immediately following the Great Mortality, Europe entered a strange age of reflection. Chroniclers and clerks, monks and merchants began to write, not only to record what had happened, but to understand it. They filled their parchment with memories of loss, of horror, of survival. In their words, the medieval world began to find a new voice. In Italy, where the plague had first struck, a young writer named Giovanni Boccaccio published a book unlike any written before. He called it the Decameron. It told of 10 young people who fled Florence during the plague and passed the time by telling stories, 100 tales of love, folly, tragedy, and wit. Boccaccio's work was not just entertainment, it was defiance. It was the first great attempt to say, even in death, humanity endures. His characters laughed, sinned, loved, and lived, while the world outside their villa burned. The Decameron was a mirror held up to the plague, and what it reflected was life. In England, the spirit of that rebirth found its own voice. The monks of St. Albans recorded the horrors of the pestilence, but their chronicles were more than records. They were elegies. They described not only the deaths of kings and bishops, but of farmers, mothers, and children. For the first time, the lives of ordinary people were deemed worthy of memory. The poet William Langland, writing in the 1350 seconds, transformed that same sorrow into poetry. In his visionary work, Piers Plowman, he imagined a world where greed and corruption had poisoned both church and crown. Through allegory and dream, he sought purity, not through priests or penance, but through honest labor and compassion. His plowman was no knight, no lord, but a common man, and in him, Langland gave voice to the New England that had risen from the ashes. The plague had taught people that holiness could be found not in monasteries, but in the simple act of surviving with kindness. A few years later, another poet, a young courtier named Geoffrey Chaucer, would carry that transformation even further. In the Canterbury Tales, written in the 1380 seconds but born of a post-plague consciousness, Chaucer imagined pilgrims from every walk of life, noble, merchant, miller, nun, and knight, all journeying together, telling stories as equals. It was a vision that would have been unthinkable before the Black Death. The Great Mortality had erased the old barriers. In death, all men had been equal. In Chaucer's imagination, they spoke as equals too. Art, faith, and language had changed forever. The painters who filled the churches no longer sought to glorify divine perfection. Their frescoes were human, weary, tender, and real. Angels wept, saints bled. The Virgin Mary held not the infant Christ, but a child dead of plague. It was faith stripped bare, rebuilt from compassion rather than authority. Music too had changed. The grand choirs of the cathedrals had been replaced by smaller, more personal hymns, songs written not for kings, but for the living and the lost. These were melodies of mourning and resilience, of gratitude and grief entwined. Even the church itself, humbled and shaken, began to evolve. The priests who had survived the plague had seen that their robes and rituals could not protect them. Many became gentler, less certain, more human. The sermons of the 1350 seconds spoke less of judgment and more of mercy. Some began to question the need for wealth within the church. Others preached in English, so that all could understand the words of Scripture. Slowly, quietly, the foundation of medieval Christianity began to shift toward what would one day become reform. The plague had killed half of Europe, and yet, in its aftermath, it had also given birth to self-awareness. Man, for the first time in centuries, had looked into the abyss and seen not just death, but himself. In England, this new consciousness took shape not only in art and faith, but in law and governance. The old feudal bonds continued to loosen. The Statute of Labourers remained in force, but it was ignored as often as it was obeyed. Labourers moved freely, merchants grew rich, and lords adapted or perished. The rigid pyramid of medieval life was tilting towards something new, something more fluid, more dangerous, and more free. The survivors of the plague had become the architects of modernity. King Edward III, now aging, watched this transformation with weary acceptance. He had tried to restore order by decree. Instead, he had accelerated change. His later reign saw the return of war with France, but his heart was no longer in conquest. The years had softened him. He ruled now not with the arrogance of divine right, but with the melancholy of experience. He had lived through the death of his sons, the collapse of his church, and the rebellion of his people. He had seen a kingdom remade by catastrophe. In his final years, Edward spoke often of providence, but his letters reveal a more personal philosophy, one of endurance rather than victory. He wrote, "The Lord has not forsaken us. He has shown us what we are." By 1355, England was no longer the same realm that had entered the century. Its population was smaller, but its spirit was larger. The common man, once silent, now spoke. The merchant, once dismissed, now held power. The church, once absolute, now shared the conscience of its flock. The Black Death had not only ended an age, it had begun one. The memory of death was everywhere, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had become purpose. Pain had turned to understanding. Faith had turned to compassion. And in that transformation, something extraordinary had occurred. Humanity had rediscovered itself. In the winter of his later years, Edward III would sometimes walk the ramparts of Windsor Castle and look out across the fields. They were green again, alive again. The smoke of hearth fires rose from the villages below, and the bells of the churches tolled softly through the fog. He knew those bells had once tolled for the dead. Now, they tolled for the living. Edward had ruled through plague, fire, and despair. He had seen his world destroyed and reborn, and in the twilight of his reign, he understood something that had taken him a lifetime to learn, that power could command obedience, but not survival, that faith could promise eternity, but not peace. The true strength of England, he realized, lay not in kings or armies, but in its people, those who had buried the dead and built again with trembling hands. History would remember Edward III as the warrior king, the father of the 100 Years' War. But he was more than that. He was the bridge between two worlds, the medieval and the modern, the age of faith and the age of reason. He had lived through death, and in surviving, had helped his nation learn how to live. The story of Edward III and the Black Death is not merely a chronicle of plague and kings. It is the story of transformation, of how a world built on certainty collapsed and was reborn in doubt, and how from that doubt rose understanding. From 1340 to 1355, England moved through 10 years of darkness, from triumph to despair, from plague to rebirth. The people who entered the century believed in divine order. The people who left it believed in human endurance. The Black Death took half the lives in Europe, but it also gave birth to something new, the first stirrings of individual consciousness, the roots of reform, the beginnings of modern thought. Edward III's England became a nation that had looked death in the eye and refused to bow. Its people rebuilt their fields, their faith, and their future. They learned that survival is not the absence of death, but the courage to live after it. And so, when the bells of England rang once more, they did not mourn, they celebrated. In surviving death, they learned how to live. And Edward, the king who faced the plague, became the bridge between two worlds.